Hey there, patrons. Today I'm going to be reading you The Colour Out of Space by HP Lovecraft. This is part of my reading for an upcoming custom monster that I'm going to be producing for the channel. But I thought I'd take the opportunity to read a classic bit of horror literature for you from HP Lovecraft, one of the contributors, idea-wise at least, to the early D&D games. The Colour Out of Space by HP Lovecraft. West of Arkham, the hills rise wild, and there are valleys with deep woods that no axe has ever cut. There are dark, narrow glens where the trees slope fantastically, and where thin brooklets trickle without ever having caught the glint of sunlight. On the gentler slopes there are farms, ancient and rocky, with squat, moss-covered cottages, brooding eternally over New England secrets in the lee of great ledges. But these are all vacant now, the wide chimneys crumbling, and the shingling sides bulging perilously beneath low gambrel roofs. The old folk have gone away, and the foreigners do not like to live there. French Canadians have tried it, Italians have tried it, and the Poles have come and departed. It's not because of anything that can be seen or heard or handled, but because of something that is imagined. The place is not good for the imagination, and does not bring restful dreams at night. It must be this which keeps the foreigners away, for old Amny Pierce has never told them of anything he recalls from the strange days. Amny, whose head has been a little queer for years, is the only one who still remains, or who ever talks of the strange days, and dares to do this because his house is so near the open fields and the travelled roads around Arkham. There was once a road over the hills and through the valleys that ran straight where the blasted heath is now, but people ceased to use it, and a new road was laid curving far toward the south. Traces of the old one can still be found amidst the weeds of the returning wilderness, and some of them will doubtless linger even when half the hollows are flooded for the new reservoir. Then the dark woods will be cut down, and the blasted heath will slumber far beneath blue waters, whose surface will mirror the sky and ripple in the sun. And the secrets of the strange days will be one of the deep secrets, one of the hidden lore of the old ocean, and all the mystery of primal earth. When I went into the hills and vales to survey for the new reservoir, they told me the place was evil. They told me this in Arkham, and because it's a very old town full of old legends, I thought the evil must be something which grandams had whispered to grandchildren through the centuries. The name Blasted Heath seemed to be very odd and theatrical, and I wondered how it had come into the folklore of the Puritan people. Then I saw that dark westward tangle of glens and slope for myself, and I ceased to wonder at anything besides its own elder mystery. It was morning when I saw it, but shadows lurked always there, and the trees grew thickly, and their trunks were too big for any healthy New England wood. There was too much silence in the dim valleys between them, and the floor was too soft with the dank moss and mattlings of infinite years of decay. In the open spaces, mostly along the line of the old road, there were little hillside farms, sometimes with all the buildings standing, sometimes with only one or two, and sometimes with only a lone chimney or fast-falling cellar. Weeds and briars reigned, and furtive wild things rustled in the undergrowth. Upon everything was a haze of restlessness and oppression, a touch of the unreal and the grotesque, as if some vital element of the perspective or chiaroscuro had gone awry. I do not wonder that the foreigners would not stay, for this was no region to sleep in. It was too much like the landscape of Selva del Rosa, too much like some forbidden woodcut in a tale of terror. But even all this was not so bad as the blasted heath. I saw it the moment I came upon it at the bottom of a spacious valley, for no other name could fit such a thing, or any other thing fit such a name. It was as if the poet had coined the phrase from having seen this one particular region. It must, I thought, as I viewed it, be the outcome of a fire, but why had nothing ever regrown over those 5 acres of grey desolation that sprawled open to the sky like a great spot eaten by acid on the woods and fields? It lay largely to the north of the ancient road line, but encroached a little on the other side. I felt an odd reluctance upon approaching, and did so only because my business took me through and past it. There was no vegetation of any kind on that broad expanse, and only a fine grey dust of ash, which no wind seemed to ever blow about, and the trees near it were sickly and stunted, and many dead trunks stood or lay rotting at the rim. As I walked hurriedly by, I saw the tumbled bricks and stones of an old chimney and cellar on my right, and the yawning black maw of an abandoned well, whose stagnant vapours played some strange tricks with the hues of the sunlight. Even the long, dark woodland climb beyond seemed welcome in contrast, and I marvelled no more at the frightened whispers of the Arkham people. There had been no house or ruin near, and even in the old days this place must have been lonely and remote. And at twilight, dreading to repass that ominous spot, I walked circuitously back to the town by the curving road to the south. I vaguely wished some clouds would gather, for an odd timidity about the deep skying voids above crept into my soul. In the evening, I asked old people in Arkham about the blasted heath, and what was meant by that phrase "strange days," which so many evasively muttered. I could not, however, get any good answers, except that all the mystery was much more recent than I had dreamed. It was not a matter of old legendary at all, but something within the lifetime of these people who spoke. It had happened in the 80s, and the family had disappeared or was killed. Speakers would not be exact, and because they had all told me to pay no attention to old Amney Pierce's crazy tales, I sought him out the next morning, having heard that he lived alone in an ancient tottering cottage, where the trees first began to get very thick. It was a fearsomely archaic place, and had begun to exude the faint miasmal odour which clings about houses that have stood too long. Only with persistent knocking could I rouse the aged man, and when he shuffled timidly to the door I could tell he was not glad to see me. He was not so feeble as I had expected, but his eyes drooped in a curious way, and his unkempt clothing and white beard made him seem even more worn and dismal. Not knowing just how he could best be launched on his old tales, I feigned a matter of business and told him of my surveying, and asking vague questions about the district. But he was far brighter and more educated than I had been led to think, and before I knew it, he had grasped quite as much of the subject as any man I had talked to with Arkham. He was not like other rustics I had known in the sections where reservoirs were to be. For him, there were no protests at the miles of old wood and farmland to be blotted out, though perhaps there would have been had not his home lain outside the bounds of the future lake. Relief was all that he showed, relief at the doom of the dark ancient valleys which he had roamed all his life. They were better underwater now, better underwater since the strange days, and with this opening his husky voice sank low, while his body leaned forward, and his right forefinger began to point shakily and impressively. It was then that I heard the story, and as the rambling voice scraped and whispered on, I shivered again and again despite the summer day. Often I recall the speaker from ramblings, piece out scientific points that he knew only by the fading parrot memory of his professor's talk, or bridge over gaps where his sense of logic and continuity broke down. When he was done, I did not wonder that his mind had snapped a trifle, or that the folk of Arkham would not speak much of the blasted heath. I, and the next day, returned to Boston to give up my position. I could not go to the dim chaos of Old Forest and Slope again, or face another time on that grey blasted heath, where the black well yawned deep and beside the tumbled bricks and stones. The reservoir would soon be built now, and all those elder secrets would be safe forever under the watery fathoms. But even then I do not believe that I would visit that country by night, at least not when the sinister stars are out and nothing would bribe me to drink the water in the city of Arkham. All that began, Amney said, with the meteorite. Before that time there had been no wild legends in all these at all since the witch trials in the ancient days, and even these western woods were not feared half as much as the small island of the Miskatonic where the devil held court beside a curious stone altar older than the Indians. These were not haunted woods, and their fantastic dusk was never terrible till the strange days. And then there came that white noontide cloud, that string of explosions in the air, and that pillar of smoke from the sky in the far wood. And by night all Arkham had heard of the great rock that fell from the sky and embedded itself in the ground beside the well at the Nahum Gardner place. That was the house which stood where the blasted heath was to come, and the trim white Nahum Gardner house amidst its fertile gardens and orchards. Nahum had come to town to tell people about the stone, and had dropped in at Amney Pierce's on his way. Amney was 40 then, and all the queer things were fixed very strongly in his mind, And he and his wife has gone to the three professors at Miskatonic University, who hastened out the next morning to see the weird visitor from an unknown stellar space, and had wondered why Nahum had called it so large the day before. It had shrunk, Nahum said, as he pointed at the big brownish mound above the rippled earth and the charred grass near the archaic well sweep in his front yard. But the wise men answered that stones do not shrink. Its heat lingered persistently, and Nahum declared it had glowed faintly in the night. The professors tried it with a geologist's hammer and found it was oddly soft. It was, in truth, so soft as to be almost plastic, and they gouged rather than chipped a specimen to take back to the college for testing. They took it in an old pail borrowed from Nahum's kitchen, and even the small piece refused to grow cool. On the trip back, they stopped at Amney's to rest and seemed thoughtful when Mrs. Pierce remarked that the fragment was growing smaller and burning the bottom of the pail. Truly, it was not large, but perhaps they had taken less than they thought. The next day after that, as it was June of 82, the professors had trooped out again in a great excitement. As they passed Amney's, they told him what queer things that specimen had done, and how it had faded wholly away when it was put in a glass beaker. The beaker had gone too, and the wise men talked of the strange stone's affinity for silicon. It had acted quite unbelievably in that well-ordered laboratory, doing nothing at all and shewing no occluded gases which heated on charcoal, being wholly negative in the borax bead, and soon proved itself absolutely non-volatile at any producible temperature, including that of the oxyhydrogen blowpipe. On an anvil it appeared highly malleable, and its luminosity was very marked. Stubbornly refusing to grow cool, it soon had the college in a state of real excitement, and when upon heating before the spectroscope it displayed shining bands unlike any known colours of the normal spectrum. There was much breathless talk of new elements, bizarre optical properties, and other things which puzzled men of science, as wont to say they faced the unknown. Hot as it was, they tested it in a crucible with all the proper reagents. Water did nothing. Hydrochloric acid was the same, nitric acid, and even aqua regia merely hissed and spattered against its torrid invulnerability. Amney had difficulty in recalling all these things, but recognized some solvents as I mentioned them in the order of use. There were ammonia and caustic soda, alcohol and ether, nauseous carbon disulfide, and dozens of others. But although their weight grew steadily less as time passed and the fragments seemed to be slightly cooling, there was no change in the solvents that shew that they attacked their substance at all. It was a metal, though, beyond a doubt. It was magnetic, for one thing, and after its immersion in the acid solvents there seemed to be faint traces of Woodman-Staten figures found in the meteoric iron. When the cooling had grown considerable, testing was carried out in glass, and it was a glass beaker that left all the chips made of the original fragment from the work. The next morning both chips and beaker were gone without a trace, and only a charred spot marked this place in the wooden shelf where they had been. All this the professors told Abney as they paused at his door, and once more went with him to see the stony messenger from the stars, though this time his wife did not accompany them. It had now mostly grown, certainly shrunk, and even the sober professors could not doubt the truth of what they saw. All around the dwindling lump near the well was a vacant space except where the earth had caved in, and whereas it had been a good 7 feet across the day before, it was now scarcely 5. It was still hot, and the sages studied its surface curiously as they detached another larger piece with hammer and chisel, then gouged deeply this time, and as they pried away the smaller mass, they saw the core of the thing was quite homogeneous. They had uncovered what seemed to be the side of a large coloured globule embedded in the substance. The colour, which resembled some of the bands in the meteor's strange spectrum, was almost impossible to describe, and it was only by analogy that they called it a colour at all. Its texture was glossy, and upon tapping it appeared to promise both brittleness and hollowness. One of the professors gave it a smart blow with his hammer, and it burst with a nervous little pop. Nothing was emitted, and all trace of the thing vanished with the puncturing. It left behind a hollow spherical space about 3 inches across, and although all thought it probable that others would be discovered as the enclosing substance was wasting away, conjecture was vain, so after a futile attempt to find additional globules with drilling, the seekers left again with their new specimen, which proved, however, as baffling in the laboratory as the previous predecessor had been. Aside from being almost plastic, having heat, magnetism, and slight luminosity, cooling slightly in acid fluid, powerful acids possessing an unknown spectrum, wasting away in air and attacking silicon compounds with mutual destruction as a result, it presented no identifying features whatsoever, and at the end of the tests the college scientists were forced to own that they could not place it. It was nothing of this earth, but a piece of the great outside, and as such, dowered with outside properties and obedient to its outside laws. That night there was a thunderstorm, and when the professors went out to Nahum's the next day they met with bitter disappointment. The stone magnetic acid had must have had some peculiar electrical property, for it had drawn the lightning, as Nahum said, with a singular persistence. 6 times within an hour the farmer saw the lightning strike the farrow in the front yard, and when the storm was over, nothing remained but a ragged pit by the ancient well sweep. Half choked with caved-in earth, digging had borne no fruit, and the scientists verified the fact of its utter vanishment. The failure was total, so nothing was left to do but to go back to the laboratory and test again the disappearing fragment, left carefully encased in lead. This fragment lasted a week, at the end of which nothing of value had been learned of it, and when it was gone, no residue was left behind, and in time the professors felt scarcely sure that they had indeed seen the waking eyes, the cryptic visage of the fathomless gulfs outside, that lone weird message from the outer universe and other realms of matter, force, and entity. As was natural, the Arkham newspapers made much of the incidents with its collegiate sponsoring and sent reporters to talk with Nahum Gardner and his family. At least one Boston daily also sent out a scribe, and Nahum quickly became a kind of local celebrity. He was a lean, genial person of about 50, living with his wife and 3 sons in a pleasant farmstead in the valley. He and Amney exchanged frequent visits, as did their wives, and Amney had nothing but praise for him after all the meteorite. After all these years, he seemed slightly proud of the notice his place had attracted, and talked often of the meteorite in the succeeding weeks. That July and August were hot, and Nahum worked hard at his haying in the 10-acre pasture outside Chapin's Brook. His rattling wain wearing deep ruts in the shadowy lanes between, and the labour tired him more than it had in other years, and he felt that age was beginning to tell on him. Then fell the time of fruit and harvest. The pears and apples slowly ripened, and Nahum vowed that his orchards were prospering as never before. The fruit was growing to phenomenal size and unwanted gloss, and in such abundance that extra barrels were ordered to handle the future crop. But with the ripening came sore disappointment, for of all that gorgeous array of specious lusciousness, not one single jot was fit to eat, and into the fine flavour of the pears and apples had crept a stealthy bitterness and sickishness, so that even the smallest of bite produced a lasting disgust. It was the same with the melons and tomatoes, and Nahum sadly saw that his entire crop was lost. It was lost. Quick to connect events, he declared that the meteorite had poisoned the soil, and thanked heaven that most of his other crops were on upland roads along the road. Winter came early, and it was very cold. Amney saw Nahum less often than usual, and observed that he had begun to look worried. The rest of his family, too, seeming to have grown taciturn, and were far from steady in their church-going or their attendance to the various social events of the countryside. For this reserve or melancholy no cause could be found, though all the household confessed now and then to poorer health and a feeling of vague disquiet. Nahum himself gave the most definite statement of anyone when he said that he was disturbed about certain footprints in the snow. There were the usual winter prints of red squirrels, white rabbits, and foxes, but the brooding farmer professed to see something not quite right about their nature and arrangement. He was never specific, but appeared to think that they were not characteristic of the anatomy and habits of squirrels and rabbits and foxes as they ought to be. Amney listened with interest to this talk until one night, when he drove past Nahum's house in his sleigh on his way back from Clark's Corners. There'd been a moon, and a rabbit had run across the road, and the leaps of the rabbit were longer than Amney or his horse liked, and latter, indeed, had almost run away when brought up by a firm rein. Thereafter, Amney gave Nahum's tales more respect, and wondered why the Gardner dogs seemed so cowed and quivering every morning. They had, it developed, nearly lost the spirit to bark. In February, McGregor boys from Meadow Hill were out shooting woodchucks, not far from Gardner Place, bagged a very peculiar specimen. The proportions of its body seemed slightly altered in a queer way impossible to describe, while its face had taken on the expression which no one had ever seen in a woodchuck before. The boys were genuinely frightened and threw the thing away at once, so that only their grotesque tales of it ever reached the people of the countryside. But the shying of the horses near Nahum's house had become an acknowledged thing, and all the basis for a cycle of whispered legend was fast taking form. People vowed that the snow melted faster around Nahum's than it did anywhere else, and early in March there was an awed discussion in Potter's General Store at Clark's Corners. Stephen Rice had driven past Gardner's in the morning and had noticed the skunk cabbages coming out through the mud by the woods around the road. Never were such things of that size before. They had strange colours that could not be put into words. The shapes were monstrous, and the horses had snorted at an odour which struck Stephen as wholly unprecedented. That afternoon several persons drove past to see abnormal growth, and all agreed the plants of that kind ought never to sprout in a healthy world. The bad fruit of the fall was freely mentioned, and it went from mouth to mouth that there was poison in Nahum's ground. Or, of course, it was the meteorite, and remembering how strange the men from the college had found the stone to be, several farmers spoke about the matter to them. One day they paid Nahum his visit, but having no love of weird tales, the folk law were very conservative in what they inferred. The plants were certainly odd, but all skunk cabbages are more or less odd in shape and colour and hue. Perhaps some mineral element from the stone had entered the soil, but it would soon be washed away. And as for the footprints and frightened horses, of course this was mere country talk, which such a phenomenon as the aerolite would be certain to start. But there was really nothing serious for serious men to do in cases of wild gossip or superstitious rustics would say and believe anything. And so all through the strange days the professors stayed away in contempt. Only one of them, when given 2 vials of dust for analysis in a police job over a year and a half later, recalled that the queer colour of that skunk cabbage had been very like one of the anomalous bands of light shown by the BTL fragment in the college spectroscope, and like the brittle globule found embedded in the stone from the abyss. The samples in that analysis case gave the same odd bands at first, though later they lost that property. The trees budded prematurely around Nahum's, and at night they swayed ominously in the wind. Nahum's second son, Thaddeus, a lad of 15, swore that he swayed also when there was no wind, but even the gossips would not credit this. Certainly, however, restlessness was in the air. The entire Gardner family developed the habit of stealthy listening, though not for any sound which they could consciously name. The listening was indeed rather a product of moments when consciousness seemed to half slip away. Unfortunately, such moments increased week by week, till it became common speech that something was wrong with all the Nahum's folks. When the early saxifrage came out, it had another strange colour, not quite like that of the skunk cabbage, but plainly related and equally unknown to anyone who saw it. Nahum took some blossoms to Arkham and showed them to the editor of the Gazette, but that dignitary did not write more than a humorous article about them, in which the dark fears of rustics were held up to polite ridicule. It was a mistake of Nahum's to tell a solid city man about the way the great overgrown mourning cloak butterflies behaved in connection with these saxifrages. April brought a kind of madness to the country folk, and began the disuse of the road past Nahum's which led to its ultimate abandonment. It was the vegetation. All the orchard trees blossomed forth in strange flowers, and though the stony soil of the yard and adjacent pasturage there sprung up a bizarre growth, which only a botanist could connect with the proper flora of the region. No sane, wholesome colours were anywhere to be seen except in the green grass and leafage, but everywhere these hectic and prismatic variants of some diseased underlying primary tone, without a place among the known taints of earth. The Dutchman's breeches became a thing of sinister menace, and the bloodroots grew insolent in their chromatic perversion. Amney and the gardeners thought that most of the colours had a sort of a haunting familiarity, and decided that they reminded them of one of the brittle globules in the meteor. Nahum ploughed and sowed the 10-acre pasture and the upland lot, but did nothing with the land around his house. He knew it would be of no use, and he hoped that the summer's strange growth would grow all the poison from the soil. He was prepared for almost anything now, and had grown used to a sense of something near him waiting to be heard. The shunning of his house by neighbours told on him, of course, and it told on his wife more. The boys were better off being at school each day, but they could not help being frightened by the gossip. Thaddeus, an especially sensitive youth, suffered the most. In May, the insects came, and Nahum's place became a nightmare of buzzing and crawling. Most of the creatures seemed not quite usual in their respects and motions, and their nocturnal habits contradicted all former experience. The gardeners took to watching at night, watching in all directions at random for something. They could not tell what. And that they all owned that Thaddeus had been right about the trees. Mrs. Gardner was the next to see it from the window as she watched the swollen boughs of a maple against a moonlight sky. The boughs surely moved, and there was no wind. It must be the sap. Strangeness had come into everything growing now, and yet it was none of Nahum's family at all who had made the next discovery. Familiarity had dulled them, and what they could not see was glimpsed by a timid windmill salesman from Bolton who drove up one night in ignorance of the country's legends. What he told in Arkham was given a short paragraph in the Gazette, and it was there that all of the farmers, Nahum included, saw it first. The night had been dark and the buggy lamps faint, but around a farm in the valley which everyone knew from the account must be Nahum's, the darkness had been less thick. A dim though distinct luminosity seemed to adhere in all vegetation, grass, leaves, and blossoms alike, which at one moment a detached piece of the phosphorescent appeared to stir furtively in the yard near the barn. The grass had so far seemed untouched, and the cows were freely pastured in the lot near the house, but toward the end of May the milk began to turn bad. And then Nahum and the cows had the cows driven to the uplands, which after the trouble ceased. Not long after this change in the grass and the leaves became apparent to the eye. All the verdure was going grey. It was developing a high singular quality of brittleness. Amney was now the only person who ever visited the place, and his visits were becoming fewer and fewer. When school closed, the gardeners were virtually cut off from the world, and sometimes let Amney do their errands in town. They were failing curiously, both physically and mentally, and no one was surprised with the news of Mrs. Gardner's madness stole around. It happened in June, about the anniversary of the meteor's fall, and the poor woman screamed about things in the air which she could not describe. In her raving there was not a single specific noun, only verbs and pronouns. Things moved and changed and fluttered, and ears tingled to impulses which were not wholly sounds. Something was taken away. She was being drained of something. Something was fastening itself on her that ought not to be. Someone must make it to keep off. Nothing was ever still in the night. The walls and the windows shifted. Nahum did not send her to the country asylum, but let her wander the house as long as she was harmless to herself and others. Even when her expression changed, he did nothing. But when the boys grew afraid of her, and Thaddeus nearly fainted at the way she made faces at him, he decided to keep her locked on the attic. By July she had ceased to speak and crawled on all floors, and before the month was over, Nahum got the mad notion that she was slightly luminous in the dark, as he now clearly saw was the case in the nearby vegetation. It was a little before this that the horses had stampeded. Something had roused them in the night, and their neighing and kicking at the stalls had been terrible. There seemed virtually nothing to do to calm them, and when Nahum opened the stable door, they all bolted out like frightened woodland deer. It took a week to track all four, and when they were found, they seemed to be quite useless and unmanageable. Something had snapped in their brains, and each one had to be shot for its own good. Nahum borrowed a horse from Amney for his haying, but found it would not approach the barn. It shied, balked, and whinnied, and in the end it could do nothing but drive into the yard, while the men used his own strength to get the heavy wagon near enough to the hayloft for convenient pitching. And all the while the vegetation was turning grey and brittle. Even the flowers whose hues had been so strange were greying now, and the fruit was coming out grey and dwarfed and tasteless. The asters and goldenrod bloomed grey and distorted, and the roses and zinnias and hollyhocks in the front yard were such blasphemous-looking things that Nahum's oldest boys, Zenas, cut them down. The strangely puffed insects died at the same time, even the bees that had left their hives and taken to the woods. By September all the vegetation was fast crumbling to a greyish powder, and Nahum feared that the trees would die before the poison was out of the soil. His wife had now spells of terrific screaming, and he and the boys were in a constant state of nervous tension. They shunned people now, and when school opened the boys didn't go. And it was Amney, on one of his rare visits, who first realised that the well water was no longer good. It had an evil taste that was not exactly fetid, but not exactly salty, and Amney advised his friend dig another well on higher ground to use to till the soil until it was good again. Nahum, however, ignored the warning, for he had by that time become callous to strange and unpleasant things. He and the boys continued to use the tainted supply, drinking it as listlessly and mechanically as they ate. They ate their meagre and ill-cooked meals and did their thankless and monotonous chores through the aimless days. There was something of stolid resignation about them all, as if they had walked half in another world between lines of nameless guards to a certain and familiar doom. Thaddeus went mad in September after a visit to the well. He'd gone with a pail and had come back empty-handed, shrieking and waving his arms, sometimes lapsed into inane titter as a whisper about the moving colours down there. 2 in one family was pretty bad, but Nahum was very brave about it. He let the boy run about for a week until he began stumbling and hurting himself, and then he shut him in the attic, across the hall from his mother's. The way they screamed at each other from behind locked doors was very terrible, especially to little Merwin, who fancied they talked in some strange, terrible language that was not of the earth. Merwin was getting frightfully imaginative, and his restlessness was worse after the shutting away of his brother, who had been his greatest playmate. Almost the same time the mortality among the livestock commenced, poultry turned greyish and died very quickly, their meat being found dry and noisome upon cutting. Hogs grew inordinately fat and then suddenly began to undergo loathsome changes that no one could explain. Their meat was, of course, useless, and Nahum was at his wit's end. No rural veterinary would approach this place, and the city veterinary from Arkham was openly baffled. The swine began growing grey and brittle and falling to pieces before they died, and their eyes and muzzle developed singular alterations. It was very inexplicable. They had never been fed from the tainted vegetation. Then something struck the cows. Certain areas, or sometimes the whole body, would uncannily shrivel or compress, and atrocious calluses or disintegration were common. In the last stages, the death was always the result. There would be a greying and turning brittle that was beset the hogs, but there could be no question it was poison, for all the cases occurred in a locked and undisturbed barn. No bites of prowling things could have brought the virus, for what live beast on earth could pass anything that was beyond the mind's guessing? When the harvest came, there was not an animal surviving on the place, for the stock and poultry were dead and the dogs had run away. The dogs, 3 in number, had all vanished one night and were never heard from again. The 5 cats had left the same time before, but their going was scarcely noticed, since now there seemed to be no mice, and only Mrs. Gardner had made pets of the graceful felines. On the 19th of October, Nahum staggered into Amney's house with hideous news. The death had come to poor Thaddeus in his attic room, and had come in such way that could not be told. Nahum had dug a grave in the railed family plot outside the farm, and had put therein what he found. There could have been nothing from outside, for the small barred window and locked door were intact. It was as much as it had been in the barn. Amney and his wife consoled the stricken man as best they could, but shuddered as they did so. Stark terror seemed to cling to the Gardners and all they touched, and the very presence of one of them in the house was a breath from regions unnamed and unnameable. Amney accompanied Nahum home with the greatest reluctance, and he did what he could to calm the hysterical sobbing of little Merwin. Zenas needed no calming. He had come of late to do nothing but stare into space and obey what his father told him, and Amney thought that his fate was very merciful. Now and then Merwin's screams were answered faintly from the attic. In response to an inquiring look, Nahum said that his wife was getting very feeble. When night approached, Amney managed to get away, for not even friendship would make him stay in the spot when the faint glow of the vegetation and the trees may or may not have swayed without wind, and it was really lucky for Amney that he was not more imaginative. Even as things were, his mind was bent ever so slightly. But had he been able to connect and reflect upon all the portents around him, he must inevitably have turned into a total maniac. In the twilight he hastened home, and the screams of the mad woman and the nervous child ringing horribly in his ears. 3 days later, Nahum lurched into Amney's kitchen in the early morning. In the absence of his host, stammered out a desperate tale once more, while Mrs. Pearce listened in a clutching fright. It was little Mervyn this time. He was gone. He had gone out late at night with a lantern and a pail for water, and had never come back. He'd been going to pieces for days and hardly knew where, what he was, screamed at everything. There had been a frantic shriek from the yard then, but before the father could get to the door, the boy was gone. There was no glow from the lantern he had taken, and of the child himself, no trace. At the time, Nahum thought the lantern and pail were gone too, but when dawn came, the man had plodded back from his late all-night search of the woods and fields, and he had found some very curious things near the well. There was a crushed and apparently somewhat melted mass of iron, which had certainly been the lantern, while a bent pail and twisted iron hoops beside it, both half-fused, seemed to hint at the remnants of the pail. That was all. Nahum was past imagining. Mrs. Pearce was blank, and Amni, when he had reached home and heard the tale, could give no guess. Mervyn was gone, and there would be no use in telling the people around, who shunned all gardeners now. No use either in telling the city people at Arkham, who laughed at everything. Thad was gone, and now Mervyn was gone, and something was creeping and waiting to be seen and felt and heard. Nahum would go soon. He wanted Amni to look after his wife and Zenas if they survived him. It must all be a judgment of some sort, though he could not fancy for what, since he had always walked uprightly in the Lord's ways so far as he knew. For over 2 weeks Amni saw nothing of Nahum, and then worried about what might have happened. He overcame his fears and paid the garden a place of visit. There was no smoke from the great chimney, and for a moment the visitor was apprehensive of the worst. The aspect of the whole farm was shocking. Greyish, withered grass and leaves on the ground, vines falling and brittle wreckage from archaic walls and gables, the great bare trees clawing up at the sky, November sky with a studied malevolence, which Amni could not feel had come from some subtle change in the tilt of the branches. But Nahum was alive after all. He was weak and lying on a couch in the low-ceilinged kitchen, but perfectly conscious and able to give simple orders to Zenas. The room was deadly cold, and Amni visibly shivered. The host shouted huskily to Zenas for more wood. Wood, indeed, was sorely needed, since the cavernous fireplace was unlit and empty, with a clod of soot blowing about in the chill wind that came down the chimney. Presently Nahum asked if the extra wood had made him any more comfortable, and then Amni saw what had happened. The stoutest cord had broken at last, and the hapless farmer's mind was proof against more sorrow. Questioning tactfully, Amni could get no clear data about the missing Zenas. "In the well, he lives in the well," was all that this clouded father would say. And there were flashes across the visitor's mind, a sudden thought of the mad wife, and he changed his line of inquiry. "Nabby, why, here she is," was the surprised response of poor Nahum, and Amni saw soon that he must search for himself, leaving the harmless babbler on the couch. He took the keys from the nail beside the door and climbed the creaking stairs to the attic. He was very close and noisome up here, and no sound could be heard from any direction. Of the 4 doors in sight, only one was locked, and on this he tried various keys on the ring he had taken. The 3rd key proved the right one, and after some fumbling, Amni threw open the low white door. It was dark, quite dark inside, for the window was small and half obscured by crude wooden bars, and Amni could see nothing at all on the wide-planked floor. The stench was beyond enduring, and before proceeding further he had to retreat into another room and return with his lungs filled with breathable air. And when he did enter, he saw something dark in the corner, and upon seeing it more clearly, he screamed outright. While he screamed, he thought a momentary cloud eclipsed the window, and a second later he felt himself brushed as if by some hateful current of vapour. Strange colours danced before his eyes, and had not a present horror numbed him, he would have thought of the globule in the meteor and that geologist's hammer had shattered, and of the morbid vegetation that had sprouted in the spring. As it was, he thought only of the blasphemous monstrosity which confronted him, and which all too clearly had shared the nameless fate of young Thaddeus and the livestock. But the terrible thing about this horror was that it was very slowly and perceptibly moving as it continued to crumble. Amni would give no more addled particulars in this scene, but the shape in the corner does not reappear in his tale as a moving object. There are things that cannot be mentioned, and what is done in common humanity is sometimes cruelly judged by the law. I gathered that no moving thing was left in the attic room, and that to leave anything capable of motion there would have been a deed so monstrous as to damn any accountable being to eternal torment. Anyone but a stolid farmer would have fainted or gone mad, but Amni walked consciously through that low doorway and locked the accursed secret behind him. There would be no Nahum to deal with now. He must be fed and tended and removed to some place where he could be cared for. Commencing his descent of the dark stairs, Amni heard a thud below him, and even thought a scream had been suddenly choked off, and recalled nervously the clammy vapour which had brushed by him in the frightful room above him. What presence had his cry and entry startled up? Halted by some vague fear, he heard still further sounds below. Indubitably, there was a sort of heavy dragging, and a most detestably sickly noise, as of some fiendish and unclean species of suction. With an associative sense goaded to feverish heights, he thought unaccountably of what had seen upstairs. Good God! What eldritch dream world was this into which he had blundered? He dared move neither backward nor forward, but stood in the trembling at the black carve of the boxed-in staircase. Every trifle of the scene burned itself into his brain, the sounds, the sense of dread, expectancy, the darkness, the steepness of the narrow steps, merciful heaven, the faint but unmistakable luminosity of the woodwork in sight, steps, sides, exposed heaths and beams alike. And then there was a burst forth, a frantic whinny from Amni's horse outside, followed at once by a clatter which told of a frenzied runaway. In another moment, horse and buggy had gone beyond earshot, leaving the frightened man in the dark stairs to guess what they had seen. But this was not all. There had been another sound out there, a sort of a liquid splash. Water! It must have been the well. He had left Hero untied near it, and a buggy wheel must have brushed the coping and knocked in a stone. And still the pale phosphorescent glowed in that detestably ancient woodwork. God, how old was this house? Most of it was built before 1670, and the gambrel roof not before 1730. A feeble scratching on the floor downstairs now sounded distinctly, and Amni's grip tightened on a heavy stick as he picked it up in the attic for some purpose. Slowly nerving himself, he finished his descent and walked boldly toward the kitchen. But he did not complete the walk, because what he sought was no longer there. It had come to meet him, and it was still alive after a fashion. Whether it had crawled or whether it had been dragged by an external force, Amni could not say, but the death had been at all. Everything had happened in the last half hour, but collapse, greying, and disintegration were already far advanced. But it looked horrifiedly into the distorted parody that had been a face. What was it? Nahum, what was it? He whispered, and the cleft, bulging lips were just able to crack out a final answer. Nothing. The colour, it burns. Cold and wet, but it burns. It lived in the well. I seen it. A kind of smoke, just like the flowers last spring. The well stone at night. Thad and Myrny and Xenius. Everything's alive. Sucking the life out of everything. In the stone. It must have come in the stone. Praise the whole place. Dunno what it was. The round thing them men in the college dug out in the stone, they smashed it. It was that same colour. Just the same, like the flowers and plants. Must have been more of 'em. Seeds, they growed. I seen it the first time last week. Must got a strong one. Zenis, he was a big boy, full of life. Beats it down your mind and gets you. Burns you up in the well water. He was right about it. Evil water. Zenis never came back from the well. Can't get away. Drowns you. You known something's coming, but 'tain't no use. I seen time and again. Think Xenius was took. Where's Nabby Amni? Head's no good. Don't know how long I see fed her. Or get her just a colour. Face is getting to have that colour sometimes towards night. Burns and sucks. It came from some place where things aren't as they are here. Well, them professor says he was right. Look out, Amni. I do nothing more. It sucks the life out. But that was all. That which spoke could no longer be more. no longer because it had completely caved in. Amney laid a red checked tablecloth over what was left and reeled back to the door into the fields. He climbed the slope to the 10-acre pasture and stumbled home by the north road and the woods. He could not pass by that well from which his horse had run away. He had looked at it through the window and had seen that no stone was missing from the rim. Then the lurching buggy had not dislodged anything at all. The splash had been something else, something which went into the well after it had done with poor Nahum. When Amney reached the house, the horse and buggy had arrived before him and had thrown his wife into fits of anxiety. Reassuring her without explanations, he set out at once for Arkham and notified the authorities that the gardener was no more. Their family's gone. He indulged in no details, but merely told of the deaths of Nahum and Nabby, and that of Thaddeus being already known, and mentioned that the cause seemed to be some strange ailment which had killed the livestock. He also stated that Merwin and Xenius had disappeared. There was considerable questioning at the police station, and in the end Amney was compelled to take 3 officers to the Gardner farm, together with the coroner, the medical examiner, and the veterinary who had treated the diseased animals. He went much against his will, for the afternoon was advancing, and he feared the fall of night over that accursed place, but it was some comfort to have so many people with him. The 6 men drove out in a democratic wagon, following Amney's buggy, and arrived at the pest-ridden farmhouse about 4 o'clock. Used as the officers were to gruesome experiences, not one remained unmoved at what was found in the attic, and under the red-checked tablecloth on the floor below. The whole aspect of the farm with its grey desolation was terrible enough, but those 2 crumbling objects were beyond all bounds. No one could look at them. Not even the medical examiner admitted there was very little to examine. Specimens could be analysed, of course, so he busied himself in obtaining them, and here it develops that a very puzzling aftermath occurred at the college laboratory, where the 2 files of dust were finally taken away. Under the spectroscope, both samples gave off an unknown spectrum, in which many of the baffling bands were precisely like those of the strange meteor had yielded in the previous year. The property of emitting the spectrum vanished in a month, the dust thereafter consisting mainly of alkaline phosphates and carbonates. Amney would not have told the men about the well if he had thought they had meant to do anything then and there. It was getting towards sunset, and he was anxious to be away, but he could not help glancing nervously at the stony curb of this great sweep. And when a detective questioned him, he admitted that Nahum had feared something down there, so much so that he had never even thought of searching it for Merwin and Xenius. After that, nothing would do but they had to empty and explore the well immediately. So Amney had to wait, trembling, with pail after pail of rank water was hauled up and splashed on the soaking ground outside. The men sniffed in disgust at the fluid, and toward the last it would be, since the water was phenomenally low. There was no need to speak to exactly of what they found. Merwin and Xenian were both there, in part, though the vestiges were mainly skeletal. There was also a small deer and a large dog in about the same state, and a number of bones of smaller animals. The ooze and slime at the bottom seemed inexplicably porous and bubbling, and a man who descended on handholds with a long pole found that he could sink the shaft to any depth in the mud without meeting any solid obstruction. Twilight had now fallen. Lanterns were brought from the house. Then it was seen that nothing further could be gained from the well. Everyone went indoors and conferred in the ancient sitting room, with the intermittent light of the spectral half-moon playing wanly in the grey desolation outside. The men were frankly nonplussed by the entire case, and could find no convincing common element to link the strange vegetable conditions, the unknown disease of livestock and humans, the unaccountable deaths of Merwin and Xenius in the tainted well. They had heard the common country folk, it's true, but could not believe that anything contrary to natural law had occurred. No doubt the meteor had poisoned the soil, but the illness of persons and animals who had eaten nothing grown in that soil was another matter. Was it the well water? Very possibly. It might be a good idea to analyse it, but what peculiar madness could have made both boys jump into the well? The deeds were so similar. The fragments showed that they had both suffered from the same grey, brittle death. Why was everything so grey and brittle? It was the coroner, seated near a window overlooking the yard, who first noticed the glow about the well. Night had fully set in, and all the abhorrent grounds seemed faintly luminous with more than the fitful moonbeams. But this new glow was something definite and distinct, and appeared to shoot up from the black pit like a softened ray from a searchlight, giving dull reflections on the little ground pools where the water had been emptied. It had a very queer colour, and as all the men clustered around the window, Amni gave a violent start, for this strange beam of ghastly miasma was, to him, of no unfamiliar hue. He had seen that colour before, and feared to think what it might mean. He had seen it in the nasty brittle globule in that aerolite 2 summers ago. He had seen it in the crazy vegetation of the springtime, and he thought he had seen it for an instant that very morning against the small charred window of that terrible attic room where nameless things had happened. And it flashed there for a second, and a clammy and hateful current of vapour had brushed past him, and then poor Nahum had been taken by something of that colour. He had said so at the last, said it was the globule and the plants, and after they had come the runaway in the yard and the splashing in the well, and now that was belching forth from a night a pale insidious beam of that same demonic taint. It does credit to the alertness of Amni's mind that he puzzled even then at the tense movement over a point which was essentially scientific. He could not but wonder at the gleaming of the same impression from a vapour glimpsed in the daytime against a window opening in the morning sky, and from a nocturnal exhalation as a phosphorescent mist against the black and blasted landscape. It wasn't right. It was against nature, and he thought of these terrible last moments of a stricken friend. It came from some place where things ain't as they are here. One of them professors said so. All 3 horses outside, tied to a pair of shriveled saplings by the road, were now neighing and pawing frantically. The wagon driver started for the door to do something, but Amni laid a shaky hand on his shoulder. "Don't go out there," he whispered. "There's more to this than we know. Nahum said something lived in that well that sucks your life out. He said it must be something that growed from a round ball like we've seen in the meteor stone that fell a year ago. June. Sucks and burns, he said, and is just a cloud of vapour, like the light out there now, that ye hardly see and can't tell what it is. Nahum thought it feeds on everything living and gets stronger all the time. He said he seen it there last week. It must be something from away off in the sky, like the men in the college last year said the meteor stone was. The way it made and the way it looks, way it works, ain't no way of God's world. It's something from beyond." So the men paused indecisively as the light from the well grew stronger and the hitched horses pawed and whinnied in increasing frenzy. It was truly an awful moment. With terror in that ancient and accursed house itself, 4 monstrous sets of fragments, 2 from the house and 2 from the well and the woodshed behind, and that shaft of unknown and holy iridescence from the slimy depths in front. Amni had restrained the driver on impulse, forgetting how uninjured he himself was after the clammy brushing of that colour vapour in the attic room, but perhaps it's just as well that he acted as he did. No one will ever know what was abroad that night, and though the blasphemy from beyond had not so far hurt any human of an unweakened mind, there was no telling what it might have done at that last moment, and with its seemingly increased strength and the spectral signs of purpose it was soon to display beneath the half-clouded moonlit sky. All at once, all of the detectives at the window gave a sharp, short gasp. The others looked at them, and they quickly followed his gaze upward to the point at which the idle straying had been suddenly arrested. There was no need for words. What had been disputed in country gossip was disputable no longer, and it was because of the thing that every man of that party agreed in whispering later on that strange day had never talked about again in Arkham. It is necessary to premise that there was no wind in that hour of the evening. One did not arise long afterward, but there was absolutely none then. Even the dry tips of the lingering hedge mustard and grey and blighted in the fringe of the roof or the standing Democrat wagon were unstirred, and yet amid that tense, godless calm, the high bare boughs of all the trees in the yard were moving. They were twitching morbidly and spasmodically, clawing in convulsive and epileptic madness at the moonlit clouds, scratching impotently in the noxious air as if jerked by some alien and bodiless line of linkage, with subterranean horrors writhing and struggling below the dark roots. Not a man breathed for several seconds. Then a cloud of dark depth passed over the moon, and the silhouette of clutching branches faded out momentarily. At this there was a general cry, a muffled awe, but hushed and almost identical from every throat, for the terror had not faded with the silhouette, and in a fearsome instant of deeper darkness the watchers saw wriggling at that treetop height 1,000 tiny points of faint and unhallowed radiance, tipping each bough like the fire of St. Elmo or the flames that came down on the apostles' heads of the Pentecost. It was a monstrous constellation of unnatural light, like a glutted swarm of corpse-fed fireflies dancing hellish sarabands over an accursed marsh. Its colour was that of the same nameless intrusion that Amni had come to recognise and dread. All the while the shaft of phosphorescence from the well was getting brighter and brighter, bringing to the minds of the huddled men a sense of doom and abnormality which far outdistanced any image their conscious minds could form. It was no longer singled out, it was pouring out, and as the shapeless stream of unplaceable colour left the well, it seemed to glow directly into the sky. The veterinary shivered and walked to the front door to drop the extra heavy bar across it. Amni shook no less, and had to tug and point for lack of a controllable voice when he wished to draw notice to the growing luminosity of the trees. The neighing and stamping of the horses had become utterly frightful, but not a soul of that group in the old house would have ventured forth for any earthly reward. With the moments of the shining of the trees increased, with their restless branches seemed to strain more and more towards verticality. The wood of the well sweeping was shining now, and presently a policeman dumbly pointed to some wooden sheds and beehives near the stone wall in the west. They were commencing to shine too, and then the tethered vehicles of the visitors seemed so far unaffected. Then there was a wild commotion and a clopping in the road, and as Amni quenched the lamp for better seeing, they realized that the span of frantic greys had broke their sapling and run off with a democratic wagon. The shock served to loosen several tongues, and embarrassed whispers were exchanged. "It spreads on anything organic that's been around here," muttered the medical examiner. No one replied, but the man who had been in the well gave a hint. With his long pole must have stirred up something intangible. "It was awful," he added. "There was no bottom at all, just ooze and bubbles and the feeling of something lurking under there." Amni's horse still pawed and screamed deafeningly in the road outside, and nearly drowned its faint owner's quaver as he mumbled his formless reflections. "It came from that stone. It growed down there. It's got everything living. It feeds on him, mind and body. Thad and Mamie, Xenius and Nabby. Nahum was the last. They all drank that water. It got strong on them. It came from beyond, where things ain't like they are here. Now it's going home." At this point, as the column of unknown colour flared suddenly stronger and began to weave itself into fantastic suggestions of shape, with each spectator later described differently, there came from the poor tethered hero such a sound as no man had heard before or ever from a horse. Every person in that low-pitched sitting-room stopped his ears, and Amni turned from the window in horror and nausea. Words could not convey it. When Amni looked again, the hapless beast lay huddled, inert, on the moonlit ground, beside the splintered shafts of the buggy. That was the last of Hero until they buried him the next day. But the present, there was no time to mourn, for all in that instance a detective silently called attention to something terrible in the very room with them. In the absence of the lamplight, it was clear that a faint phosphorescence had begun to pervade the entire apartment. It glowed on the broad planking floor and the fragment of rag carpet. It shimmered over the sashes of the small paned windows. It ran up and down the exposed corner posts, chorused about the shelf and mantel, and infected the very doors and furniture. Every minute saw it strengthen, and at last it was very plain that healthy living things must leave that house. Amni shooed them back the back door and path up through the fields to the 10-acre pasture. They walked and stumbled as if in a dream, and did not dare look back till they were far away from the high ground. They were glad of the path, for they could not have gone the front way, by that well. It was bad enough passing the glowing barns and sheds and those shining orchard trees with their gnarled, fiendish contours. But thank heaven the branches did their worst twisting up. The moon went under some very thick clouds as they crossed the rustic bridge over Chapman's Brook, and it was blind groping from there until the open meadows. When they looked back toward the valley and the distant Gardner place at the bottom, they saw a fearsome sight. All the farm was shining with that hideous unknown colour. Trees, buildings, and even the grass and herbage that had not been fully changed to lethal grey brittleness. The boughs were all straining upward, tipped with tongues of foul flame. The lambent cracklings of the same monstrous fire were creeping along the ridgepoles of the house, barn, and sheds. It was a scene from a vision of Fuseli, and over all of the rest reigned a riot of luminous amorphousness. that alien and undimensional rainbow of cryptic poison from the well, seething, feeling, lapping, reaching, scintillating, straining, and malignly bubbling in its cosmic and unrecognizable chromatism. Then, without warning, the hideous thing shot vertically upward toward the sky like a rocket or a meteor, leaving behind no trail and whispering through a round and curious regular hole in the clouds before any man could gasp or cry out. No watcher could ever forget that sight, and Amni stared blankly at the stars of Cygnus, Deneb, twinkling above the others, where the unknown colour had melted into the Milky Way. But his gaze was the next moment called swiftly to the earth by the crackling in the valley. It was just that, only a wooden rippling and crackling, and not an explosion, as so many others of the party vowed. Yet that outcome was the same, for in one feverish kaleidoscopic instant there burst up from that doomed and accursed farm a gleamingly eruptive cataclysm of unnatural sparks and substance, blurring the glance of those few who saw it, and sending forth to the zenith a bombarding cloudburst of such coloured and fantastic fragments as our universe must seeds disown. Though quickly reclosing vapours, they followed the great morbidity as it vanished, and in another second they had vanished too. Behind and below was only a darkness to which the men dared not return, and all that was a mountain wind that seemed to sweep down in black furrow gusts from interstellar space. It shrieked and howled and lashed the fields and distorted woods in a mad cosmic frenzy, till soon the trembling party realized that it would be no use waiting for the moon to show what was left down there at Nahum's. Too awed even to hint theories, and 7 shaking men trudged back towards Arkham by the north road. Amni was worse than his fellows and begged them to see him inside his own kitchen, instead of keeping straight on to town, for he did not wish to cross the nighted, wind-swept woods alone on his home on the main road, for he had an added shock that the others were spared, and was crushed forever with brooding fear he dared not even mention for many years to come. As the rest of the watchers on that tempestuous hill had stolidly set their faces towards the road, Amni had looked back an instant at the shadowed valley of desolation so lately sheltered his ill-starred friend, and from that stricken faraway spot he had seen something feebly rise, only to sink back down again upon the place which had the great shapeless horror had shot into the sky. It was just a colour, but not any colour of earth or heavens, and because Amni recognized that colour, and knew that this was the last faint remnant must still lurk there in that well, he was never quite right since. Amni would never go near that place again. It's over half a century now since the horror happened, but he has never been there, and will be glad when the new reservoir blots it out. I shall be glad too, for I do not like the way the sunlight changed colour around the mouth of that abandoned well as I passed. I hope the water will always be very deep, but even so I shall never drink from it. I do not think I shall visit the Arkham country hereafter. 3 of the men who had been with Amni returned the next morning to see the ruins by daylight, but they were not really any real ruins. Only the bricks in the chimney, the stones of the cellar, some mineral and metallic litter here and there, and the rim of that nefarious well. Save for Amni's dead horse, which they towed away and buried, and the buggy which they shortly returned to him, everything that had ever been living had gone. 5 eldritch acres of dusty grey desert remained, nor has anything ever grown there since. To this day it sprawls open to the sky like a great spot eaten by acid in the woods and the fields, and the few who have ever dared glimpse it in spite of the rural tales have named it the Blasted Heath. The rural tales are queer. They might have even been queerer if city men and college chemists could be interested enough to analyse the water from that disused well, or the grey dust that no wind seems to ever disperse. Botanists, too, ought to study the stunted flora on the borders of that spot, for they might shed on the country notion that the blight is spreading, little by little, perhaps by an inch a year. People say the colour of the neighbouring herbage is not quite right in the spring, and that the wild things leave queer prints on the light winter snow. Snow never seems quite so heavy in the Blasted Heath as it is elsewhere. Horses, the few that are left in this motor age, grow skittish in the silent valley, and the hunters cannot depend on their dogs too near the splotch of greyish dust. They say the mental influences are very bad too. Numbers went queer in the year after Nahum's taking, and always they've lacked the power to get away. Then the stronger-minded folk all left the region, and only the foreigners tried to live there in crumbling old homesteads. They could not stay, though, and one sometimes wonders what insight beyond ours their wild, weird stories of whispered magic have given them. Their dreams at night, they protest, are very horrible in that grotesque country. Surely the very look of the dark realm is enough to stir a morbid fancy. No traveller has ever escaped a sense of strangeness in those deep ravines, and the artists shiver as they paint thick woods whose mystery is as much of the spirit as of the eye. I myself am curious about the sensation I derived from my one lone walk before Amni told me of his tale. When twilight came and I had vaguely wished some clouds would gather, for an odd timidity about the deep greying folds of the sky had crept into my soul. Do not ask me for my opinion. I do not know. That is all. There was no one but Amni to question, for Arkham people would not talk about the strange days, and all three professors who saw the aerolite and its coloured globule are dead. There were other globules, depend on that, and one must have fed itself and escaped, and probably there was another which was too late. No doubt it is still down the well. I know there was something wrong with the sunlight I saw above that miasmal brink. The rustics say the bright creeps each year an inch or so, so perhaps there is a kind of a growth or nourishment even now. But whatever demon hatchling is in there, it must be tethered to something, or else it would have quickly spread. It's fastened to the roots of those trees that claw the air, or the current Arkham tales about fat oaks that shine and move as they ought not to at night. What it is, only God knows. In terms of matter, I suppose the thing Amni described would be called a gas. But this gas obeys laws that are not of our cosmos. This is no fruit of such worlds and suns as shine on the telescopes and photographic plates of our observatories. This is no breath from the skies whose motions and dimensions our astronomers measure, or seem too vast to measure. It was a colour out of space, a frightful messenger from unformed realms of infinity beyond all nature as we know it, from realms whose mere existence stuns the brains and numbs us with black extracosmic gulfs it throws open before our frenzied eyes. I doubt very much if Amni consciously lied to me. I do not think his tale was at all a freak of madness as the townsfolk had warned. Something terrible came to the hills and valleys on that meteor, and something terrible, though I know not in what proportion, still remains. I shall be glad to see the water come. Meanwhile, I hope nothing will happen to Amni. He saw so much of that thing, and its influence was so insidious. Why has he never been able to move away? How clearly he recalled those dying words of Nahum's. Can't get away. It draws ye. You know something's coming, but 'tain't no use. Amni's such a good old man. And when the reservoir gang gets to work, I must write the chief engineer to keep a sharp watch out for him. I would hate to think of him as the grey, twisted, brittle monstrosity which persists more and more in troubling my sleep. The end.